Wolfson Institute, for those of you who don't know me, and I've had lots of experience of NIHR programme grants, but I have to confess I have little experience of other types of programme grants. So my colleague who's joining me, Vicky, has had different sorts of programme grants, haven't you, Vicky?
Yes, yes. So I'm Vicky. I'm based at the social community psychiatry. Apologies, I sort of lost my voice, so I'll be doing this for interpretive dance for a lot of the time. But yeah, so I've had some experience with programme grants by NIHR, but also for funders like the MRC and the equivalents with EU projects as well.
Okay, and I sit on programme grants committee for NIHR, and this is my second stint on it. I did it for several years under 2 different directors, then went to HTA panel for a bit, and now I'm back on programme grants. So and so I've seen it change over the years. So we're going to talk to you about introduced to programme grants, how they're unique and different from other awards, show a few slides with some tips, and then leave loads of time for Q&A, and we'll just chip in. So maybe we'll start off talking about what's special about programme grants. So perhaps with the first slide, if that's okay with you. Is that okay with you, Vicky? And then I want to try and feel, as a GP by background, I feel very, very bad pushing Vicky to do too much talking, because that is absolutely not what you should be doing when you've got laryngitis. And so try and be kind to her. Yeah, but Vicky, do chip in if I say too much. Thank you, but look after yourself. So if Patrick, if you could share the first slide, that would be great. So thank you. This is part of our research team workshop series. This is a slide that I've adapted, which has all the different NIHR funding that you can currently get. So I thought I'd just show. So at the bottom, you've got programme grants, and you can see how they fit in. So this is NIHR's. I've added policy research programme and evidence synthesis programme because they didn't have them on their map. But this is where they think they sit, sort of between intervention and adoption. So all aspects of evaluation and right into adoption, but some invention as well. So you can see the breadth of them. The key with programme grants, NIHR programme grants, and Vicky can tell us if it's the same for other ones, is that they are a programme of work. And what programme grants committee are very, very good at doing is sussing out if people are trying to sneak in a lot of slightly or semi-related, but not really related, pieces of work and badging it all as a programme grant. So for a programme grant, at least for NIHR programme grants for applied research, they're a coherent programme of work with lots of nested and related studies. Now, traditionally, they sort of evolved into a way that they always ended up with a big RCT. And certainly if you're going for the full whack of funding, I think probably they do want some sort of definitive RCT or some definitive evaluation. They're very interested, Eileen Hay at the moment, the current director, although that's going to change soon. They're advertising for a new director, or they have done recently. And every time the director changes, they do a 5-year stint. They bring their own imprint on programme grants. So Elaine Hay at the moment, they're quite interested in getting new ways of evaluating things, lean evaluation, efficient. You'll hear lots of stuff about efficient models of evaluation. But we haven't really seen at programme grants that coming through to lots of very sort of innovative programmes. But I think people shouldn't be put off about, if they don't want to end up with a big RCT, if they want to do something different, a different type of programme, I think they're very open to it. And I don't think that's going to change in the future, although, of course, it might change slightly. So that's where programme grants sit. I don't know if you want to say anything, Vicky, about what you think makes a programme grant different from a randomised control trial or an isolated study.
Yeah, I think the main difference to me that she captured is that you have to show that it's a coherent program. So it's not just one big RCT where you do a few focus groups beforehand. Rather, it should be distinct packages of work that together make a whole and answer an objective that goes beyond just, is intervention A effective for group B? And that's common whether you're going for an MRC type, they don't necessarily call them program grants, but an MRC program, or if you're going for the NIHR, they want to see you sort of go beyond just a single study, because one of the things you always ask to rate is, could this application be better treated in something like a health technology assessment where it is a single RCT?
Thank you. Yeah, but the thing about program grants also that is rather wonderful is that often they are this coherent piece of work, but it also gives you the scope to do the rather wonderful nested or sort of like a little carbuncle on the side studies that you wouldn't be able to do with HTA. So you, for instance, might be looking and you can use that to do some really great things like looking at inequalities, making sure that you've got diversity and inclusion and things like that. So for instance, we did a program grant about chronic pain, which was quite a successful program grant. We recruited an enormous number of people and developed an intervention, but we also had a side study where we delivered the intervention in Sylheti to the local population, because we were very aware, it had all come from the realization that chronic pain is a big problem in Tower Hamlets. And so that was a really lovely separate study that we were able to do that you would just not have got funding if it was an HTA, but it was very related to the main trial. It related to sort of trying to increase to be more inclusive in the study, but it allowed us to experiment and do it in a different way, make sure the reach was good for a different population and look at acceptability. So that's the sort of nice thing about program grants, that this coherent piece of work does allow you to enrich the research, I think, very much. So I think if you give us the next slide. So before the application, program grants take an enormous amount of work. I think like 6 months to a year really is realistic, and it's it's certainly not something that you would do in sort of even 12 weeks would be really, from the get-go, would be really tough. So it's usually need to set the groundwork, give yourself plenty of time, and have got your sort of ideal team together. Obviously with NIHR, which is the funding stream I'm most familiar with, there's an enormous emphasis on co-production of research, working with experts by experience. Program grants are assessed with very knowledgeable, very wise expert by experience reviewers on the panels, and they often are the first person that the chair will turn to, and they're often they have a very sort of important voice. So it's really important for this applied health service research that the NIHR program grants that I'm familiar with fund, is that you really have very, very good PPIE involvement, and it really, not as an add-on, but as built in from sort of like the letters through the centre of the rock, really. I don't know if you want to say anything about those tips. If you don't, rest your voice.
Yeah, I was just going to say that in my experience of submitting program grants, by far the most stressful part is getting the signatures and the sign-offs that each team member needs to give. So there are a number of stages that you go through, that these typically are 2-stage processes, and particularly at the second stage, you have to get all your co-applicants have to go into the application, validate it, they have to agree to participate, they have to add their CVs. And this is before we even think about our own internal institution processes of getting sign off by institute directors and the JRMO. So it's always, if your deadline is the 19th of April, for example, you need to be thinking weeks in advance about getting these signatures, because they will not, there is no wiggle room. They will not accept a late application, and it will not now let you submit. And it's worth bearing in mind that the signatures also need to include legal representatives and finance representatives for the university as well, so members of the JRMO. So as soon as you've got an idea for your programme grant and you know that you're going for it, have a discussion with different people and start to get those signatures. Don't leave it till the night before.
That's a very good point, because quite often people, especially you've got your fantastic team, we'll talk about building your team in a minute, but they may not be very familiar with your software. They may not, you know, it, and it is, I agree with you, very stressful talking people through doing the necessary. So if we can have the next slide, please, Patrick. Okay, so these are obvious. Sorry, they've still got an old NIHR logo up there because this was a talk I gave for the NIHR years ago that I've pinched the slide from. So usually you have to prove that research question is important, obvious, demonstrate feasibility, methodological expertise, all bases covered. If you've got any qualitative research, you really do need somebody who is a proven expert in qualitative research on your team. You have to have covered underpinning theory. And I think for NIHR programme grants, it has to be conceivable that whatever you're doing or what you're going to come up with, the innovation, the intervention that you're developing, usually testing, will be disseminated within the NHS. So I've seen things turned down at programme grants committee, even if it seems like a great idea, if for instance, it involves a development of a whole new cadre of healthcare professionals who don't exist already. So it's got to be conceivable that in our rather constrained and resource poor NHS that the intervention could be disseminated. I think you have to tread a fine line here, because I would never say don't do things just because they said the NHS will never fund them. I think that's awful. But on the other hand, it would be bonkers to do something where you would be inventing a new type of healthcare professional that doesn't already exist, I think. I don't know if that, so those are some of the must-haves that I and colleagues have developed over the years. Did you add any to this slide or any thoughts on this?
No, I agree. And yeah, it's a balance between innovation and feasibility, that ultimately what they want you to demonstrate with a programme grant is benefit to people who use services within 5 years of the finish of your programme grant. So it has to have a level of feasibility, or else it may not be seen as the right stream.
Thank you. Can we have the next slide, please, Patrick? So I think the quotes are, a while back I did, a long time ago, I did a version of this talk where I got various senior researchers to say what they thought was how a successful programme grant worked. And then so these are real quotes from researchers, some of them who are still in this department and several have left. So building a team is really important for a programme grant. It's not an individual exercise. It's very much a group exercise. It's very, very collaborative, increasingly collaborative, I would say. So think about your members, the skill mix, the experience. Sometimes people get very concerned about whether they can lead a programme grant for NIHR because they've never led one before, or they feel they're relatively junior. But that, in my experience, is absolutely fine, provided you address it in your application form and have identified somebody who has experience who's going to mentor you. So you can be somebody who's not led a programme grant before, or maybe not had a huge grant before, if you address it head on in your application and have somebody who's a co-applicant who's going to offer you mentoring and support. We've talked about how PPI is really important, and of course I hope you all know by now already that we have the London Research Design Service. Part of it's based at Queen Mary, Their specific remit is to support NIHR programme grants. From September, they'll be named the Research Support Service. They'll probably still have a similar remit, and we've been re-awarded the grant. So they will continue. So fabulous support from the Research Design Service. They like to hear really early. So get in touch with them really early. As soon as you have the idea, get in touch with them. And they can help you with all sorts of free support around. They have expertise across the London RDS around different domains. They have expertise, very, very high level qualitative research expertise. They can help you with PPIE. They can, and the sooner you get to them, the more support they can give you. And of course, you get 3 statistical support from them as well. It's an amazingly good deal. So I would definitely say, lodge your request in with the RDS immediately, as soon as you're interested, and avail yourself of all the fantastic support you can get from them. I don't know if you want to add anything to this.
Just the note about experience. A programme grant was actually the first grant I ever got, and we dealt with that by putting in a co-PI. So we had a very experienced co-PI, and we actually built, as part of it, we built sort of capacity strengthening and building up an early career researcher as quite explicit in the application. So it shouldn't be a barrier. Like Steph says, it's all about having the right support around you, and they have mechanisms where they recognise that people may be a bit more inexperienced who may need more substantial support through co-PIs.
Thank you. Should we have the next slide, please, Patrick? Thank you. So for programme grants, they obviously should be grounded on previous research, because the ones I'm familiar with are applied health service research ones. I don't really know of any other types. And so they usually ask you explicitly in the guidance whether you've done a systematic review or what's the relevant systematic reviews on the area. It's a very good idea to look at what's already going on in the area. When it goes to panel, the panelists, usually there are 2 stages. The NIHR programme grants are in 2 stages. The first panel, they're reviewed by committee members, and the second panel, they're reviewed by external experts. And those are both methodological experts and also experts in the field of the particular programme. And they will go internationally to get to avoid conflicts of interest as well. You know, sometimes you could have 9 or even 13 different reviewers at stage 2. But it's really surprising how often people, this is actually true on HTA, I noticed a lot. People will apply to do a trial, and if they look at the International Trials Registry, somebody in Australia is doing a very similar trial. So it's really important to acknowledge what's already going on in the area and be aware of it. Now, this says consider a logic model. I think this must be an old slide, because that it's mandatory for a programme grant. And in fact, we'll discuss that in a minute, because the most important thing in your application is to have a logic model. I'll show you why in a minute. And you may be able to explain why you've rejected alternative study designs. So if you want to do something a bit unusual, if you're going for a cluster randomized trial, or if you're going for individual patients and they'll say, why isn't it cluster randomized, for instance, it would be a good idea to actually put that in your application. Those are some tips that we've come up with. Is there anything you'd like to add to this?
Just in terms of about what's already been done, it's knowing it, but it's also being quite explicit and acknowledging it. Don't try and hide if you know that there's been a big review, or you know that there's an ongoing study in particular, particularly if it's funded by the NHR, because they do cross-check against what they're already funding, and other proposals as well. And it's much better to be open, to acknowledge an ongoing study, but actually demonstrate how yours is different or what yours can add to that knowledge base. That looks a lot better than trying to sort of sweep it under the carpet and a reviewer coming back in the comments to say, oh, why didn't you consider this study or this study? So yeah, be clear if you do know that there's ongoing work.
Okay, thank you. Patrick, can I have the next slide? So actually this rather busy slide is actually, I think, the most important slide if you go for a programme for applied research, because this is pretty new. Towards the end of last year, they actually produced this, and I've done the web link at the bottom. So basically, they Eileen Hay and Raj, who's like a program manager and has been around forever on program grants, actually wrote an article on NIHR Open Research, their new journal, about how to do a program grant and logic model. And I think that what they're saying is you have to do a logic model like this, because I mean, I've done different logic models over the years. We all use that Kellogg book, which is a fantastic resource about doing logic models. But I think they've settled on that this is the sort of detail and the sort of level of a logic model they want. So I think it would be slightly dangerous now to do a program grant without having some logic model that has these sort of levels, you know, the inputs, the activities, the outputs, the outcome and the impact like this. And I would certainly look at that article if I was doing a program grant now. And it's a very good article. It's not hard to read or anything, but I think they're telling you what they want. So pretty good idea to do that. I don't know if you want to add anything about logic models.
No, actually, if you go on to the next slide, I just put in an example of a logic model that we just submitted and got funded by the NIHR. And as you could see, that this was for a slightly different call, but that whole idea of what's the problem, what are the resources or inputs, the outputs, and then also thinking about impact, both in the short term, mid-term, and in the long term. And it's a really good idea to do this quite early in the process, because it actually helps to crystallize your own thinking as well. If you don't know what your outcomes are, you don't know what your outputs are, then it suggests that you haven't quite formulated the idea. And the logic model should read through nicely from your application. It shouldn't mention a lot of new information that comes as a surprise, but it should be sort of an extension of what you're putting in the sort of text of your application.
Yeah, they'll often show when they're at panel meetings, they'll often have one slide up when they're discussing your application, and it might well be a logic model. And so because of that, people, I mean, we put sort of extra information around on that diagram and stuff, key things that you might want people to know. And they also do that for HGA, so it's worth knowing. Although HGA, they might often put the sort of flow chart. So the logic model is really, really important, and they will use this a lot. They'll scrutinize this to look to see that that you are able to demonstrate what you say you'll do, that it looks credible, that and certainly I think logic models are really helpful, and you wouldn't really want to do a big piece of work or any project now without thinking about how you're going to affect the change that you hope to see, and sort of thought experiment. So if we can have the next slide, that's great. Yours is wonderful. I enjoyed reading it. Thank you, Vicky. So this is what I think is a problem. I would call it triple jeopardy. The three things that go wrong when you're going for a program grant or any other sort of grant, really. Timing. I mean, it just takes a really long time. And when you're designing your project, I think you should be really honest about how hard it is going to be to get ethics and how slow local NHS R&D approvals are. And the number of times you see people sitting at committee and people have sent in a Gantt chart and they say they're going to get ethics and local approvals and be up and running in 2 months or something like that. It's just not credible. And it really damages their chances of getting funded if you look unrealistic. So be absolutely honest when you do your Gantt charts about realistic about how long it's going to take you to appoint staff, get people in post. Remember the thing, this is the thing that I always get wrong, that you think, you know, there's only about 220 working days in a year for a research assistant or for one of us because of annual leave and public holidays. And remember that people do take leave, so they can't when you're doing your recruitment plans and things like that, remember that, you know, it's never going to be as good as you think. And my new thing is that now for December, I would put, when I'm doing my recruitment thing, I would put half the recruitment I'm expecting for all the months otherwise, because it's only half a month or even less. And you can even do that in January as well, from the hangover from Christmas. So just be really realistic when about time and how long things take, how long it takes to analyze and write stuff up, how statisticians quite rightly like to have all the data, you know, and clean it. And we'll say it takes maybe 6 months from data closure to data freeze to getting the final statistical analysis write-up done. So be really honest. And qualitative research, it's amazing how many people will still put grants in where they're doing 100 qualitative interviews, you know, and they've got one researcher for 2 years doing. I mean, it's unrealistic. And that's a particular thing that the qualitative researcher expert who will review it will pick up at panel. I don't know if you've got any other things to say about the first of the timing one.
The timing as well is that quite often it's also expected that if you are successful, that you will be working on things like your protocol, your ethics prior to the start date, or at least prior to employing researchers, because what they don't also like to see is having researchers in post where there's no ethics and people are sort of sat around for a little bit of time. So you might have to factor that into your own timelines. But again, be realistic. Is it realistic if you're the PI and you've got 4 other projects that you're running? Are you realistically going to write the protocol 2 months before the contract starts, or are you going to need a project manager and then have a soft start? So it will come down to being realistic, and also we say about December and January. But also think about any other, what population you're working with. We're currently running a trial. I know this is NIHR funded, but it's the global health stream. We're running a trial in Pakistan, and we've had to add an extra month to follow-ups to take account of Ramadan. So just showing awareness of these in your Gantt charts shows that you've actually thought about the process. Everyone knows that Gantt charts are, I won't say a best guess, but they are obviously a calculated estimate. But the more thought and the more you can think about different factors, the more realistic. And what you're trying to do is give the reviewers confidence in what you're proposing.
Can I have the next slide? Thanks. So these are the 2 other things that I think are really tricky when you're designing a project. The 2 other bits, the triple jeopardy. Recruitment. People are always over enthusiastic about recruitment, and I don't know why. There must be some science behind it, but there's something about, you look at a clinic, you see the throughput of people in the clinic, you extrapolate, and as soon as you start your study, there are only half the people that you thought you're going to be able to recruit are there. It's just extraordinary. I suppose it's really human beings being a bit optimistic, but it's so when you're thinking about recruitment, look at previous studies, team track records on recruitment, clinic throughput data, but remember Steph's rule that it often turns to half as soon as you start a study. You're probably going to have a pilot or feasibility study in, and then building contingency around recruitment as well. I think those are all things that I've learned the hard way and still learning. So contingency might be, you've got the sites that you're going to do, but you have some other sites who are keen to come and join you. And if recruitment is slower than you hope, that you can approach those sites and move swiftly to them as well. And you can write all this in your proposal, because it not probably stage 1, but stage 2, because it looks like you know what you're doing. So recruitment is a nightmare. It is the biggest thing. Only 50% of NIHR projects recruit target, 50%, all the ones they fund. And that's the same, I think, for MRC. So, and even those that recruit target probably had extensions. Sorry, you're going to say something.
As I said, and just to add, if you're, when you're thinking, this also links to timelines, but particularly around recruitment, if you're thinking of doing a 12-month trial, don't think, oh, well, I could do that in 12 to 18 months. A 12-month trial can end up taking the best part of 2 to 3 years, because not all your participants are going to start at the same time. You're going to need time to set up the teams, set up any interventions. You're going to need 2 to 3 months for baseline assessments. And then every single assessment you do, you've got to factor in at least 2 to 3 months. So I was actually sat on a panel last week, and it was a 3-year maximum time limit, and someone put in that they wanted to do a trial with a 24-month follow-up following pilot and feasibility work, and it was rejected sort of outright, knowing that it was going to be unrealistic.
Very good point. The third thing that I think is so difficult, and I've learned this the hard way, is the choice of outcome measures. I think it is really difficult. We do have the COMET, the committee where and the big thing, the COMET website where you go, and they have tried to sort of identify common outcome measures that we should all be doing. I think obviously it's been a great thing, but it's really hard. And I've done program grants where we've had specific work streams that have looked at outcomes. What are the optimal outcome for this study? And still we've got it wrong. So it's really hard. Obviously that logic model will help, because you want your outcome measure to measure the sort of what you've done, what effect you've achieved. Can we measure that we've achieved that effect? PPI advice is really helpful in outcome measures, and clinometrics obviously is vital. But I think it's really worth thinking about this, because I do actually think it's a real problem. The next slide, please. I think, don't worry, we're near the end of slides and you can ask any questions. So just tips on writing the application. I think there are some senior researchers, I think Rosalind Rain, who leads the ARC at UCH, is absolutely, I've learned so much from her when she's done 2 ARC applications. She follows the instructions closely, and she always says, read the exam question, and she's absolutely right. You just have to, they come with big guidance documents and you have to follow them. They say what they want and you have to do it. And so it's really important, and you get an awful much more success if you really, it may be boring and tedious, but actually following their instructions very close and trying to glean what they want from each section and giving them that. Pay attention to each bit of the form. There are certain bits of the form. It's actually slightly better than when I wrote this originally, because they have rationalised the NHR forms, because they kept adding bits on. But there are always some bits of the form like dissemination and stuff that seem a bit dull, and you don't. But that is just as important as every other bit of the form. So make sure that you write that really well, and that you don't leave that for the last, and that you're always working and refining and getting that right. It's great if you've got colleagues who show recent successful funding application from the same funding stream for whatever you go for. I think that's really incredibly useful. It shows you what the bar's like, and you just get some tips, and things do evolve. Obviously, lots of peer review. You can get internal peer review. We're in the Wilson Institute of Population Health. We're introducing sort of early on sort of surgeries around that you can come to for advice on sort of, if you're looking at an inequalities lens. Well, contact Tor and I early if you want a bit of support. You can get support from us. You can get wonderful, professional, fantastic support from the Research Design Service. You can get colleagues, friends from different institutions or from within the institution. The lay summary is really, really important. You obviously, because we've already talked about how you're going to be working with experts by experience, PPI people. They will hopefully write it for you. They're coming alongside this journey of this research with you. They're helping you design it and plan it. So they'll write your lay summary, or at least give you lots of input. I usually put it through that Crystal Mark thing, which is free on the web, which gives you like a sort of reading age and a reading clarity. That's quite a nice thing to do if you get time to really improve your lay summary. You probably know what your weak spots are in your study, bits you're not quite sure what you're going to be doing. Perhaps it's a program grant, you know, it's a over 5 years, then maybe towards the end, further on in the grant, you may have less clarity about what's going to do, because it may be more dependent on earlier work packages. But I think that's fine. If it's not, nothing's perfect, but if you know you've got a weak spot, address them and be upfront about it. Try and mitigate it if you can. So, for instance, if you've never done any qualitative research and you want to have qualitative research, obviously have a qualitative researcher on board. If you you know, if you think the team will need training in some particular methodology, you know, have it written in, or how you're going to do it. And then I think also lots of times people get very obsessed with using every inch of paper on the form. And sometimes and as somebody has to review a lot of these things, it's horrendous when people have decided that they're going to avoid having any paragraphs. So you've just got like pages, because they want to save space. So they don't even put I mean, it's just miserable. So I don't think it's worth it for the extra words it gives you. Thinking about layout, clarity, subheadings, being kind to reviewers, I think that pays off more than getting those extra few words in and abandoning the idea of having paragraphs or subheadings. Because these people who are reviewing it may be reviewing, you know, several, well, they will be. And so you want yours to stand out as a model of clarity and accessibility. I don't know if you want to say anything there.
And so you can also, in a lot of the forms, you can also add in diagrams as well. So sometimes it's much clearer and it breaks up the text and it looks nicer. That the forms have come on a long way since the really basic ones are a few years ago. They're now all in like rich text format, so you can put in a picture, you can put in a diagram, and really just to reiterate the idea about sort of answering the exam questions. Don't make assumptions. You know your intervention really well and you know what you mean, but the reviewers will not. They will not be experts in your area. You may be lucky and have 1 or 2 people from your area at most, but you're effectively going for sort of an expert lay audience in that sense. So sort of spell it out and spell it out clearly. And on the last note about spelling, make sure you proofread it. There is nothing that winds me up more as a reviewer when it is littered with mistakes, because it then, to me, undermines the confidence I have in that team. If they can't get together to proofread and to make sure the application is consistent in different areas, then it makes you wonder how they're going to cope with a £2.5–3 million study that they've got to manage.
Exactly. Just I think I completely agree with Vicky, that it's great to have diagrams and people put photographs in, all sorts of things, but make sure it's meaningful. Because I was just thinking, very recently I was reviewing something and they put in these sort of diagrams and they really didn't show anything, you know, sort of like it didn't really do them any good. So do put things in. By all means, put diagrams or graphics in, but make sure that they're meaningful and that they're telling the story and they're adding to it. Do we have the next slide, please? Obviously, costings require expert support. We all know that. Take time to get the costings, and the costings for partners is an absolute nightmare, because a program grant will never all be people from one institution. I think that's fair to say. I don't think I've ever seen one where everybody's from the same institution. It is a very collaborative work. You're working with people in different HEIs, and they've got to get costings done from their versions of the JRMO, which may be slower, you know, and than ours. So get the costings done really early and get onto them really early, because that's another thing that can actually just completely mess you up. JRMO are really nice, and you can, if you give them enough notice, you can book some time to talk to them if you're struggling, and they will help you. The next slide, please. Do you want to talk about community engagement PPI, Vicky? Because I think
Yeah, so this was just added just to reiterate the idea that community engagement, or PPI, depending on which funder you're going for, is really something that should not be seen as an add-on, and it's something that needs to be seen as a really important part of the application. And more, we're needing to show how our research has an impact on the communities that we're working with. So typically for a program grant, you need to answer sort of two main questions. How have you involved people in the application? So up until this point, where has the idea come from? Have you taken it to user groups? Have you got co-applicants with experience that have added to the research? But you also need to say how you plan to involve people. So moving forward throughout the 4 or 5 years of a program grant, how are you going to involve people? And when we say involve people, we don't mean they're going to be participants in my focus group to develop the intervention. That is sort of participation and its involvement in some ways, but it's not what they're talking about. They're talking about how are people going to make a real sort of change to the actual nature of the research, how are they going to get involved in discussions about the research questions, the methods, and how things are disseminated. And in your application, try to be as specific as possible. So rather than just saying we had one service user group and we took our ideas, actually point out, well, what has changed as a result of that group? So did you change the methodology? Did you change X, Y, and Z? Because again, it gives more confidence that you're actually taking on board the expert opinion. And if you can, it's always good to have co-applicants who are people with lived experience, or to have some kind of user group involvement. So it's not just seen as tokenistic, but be mindful, if you put a user co-applicant on and everyone else is on 20%, you will get flagged up if they're only on at 2%. So you've got to think about what contribution you want that person to make, and being realistic at how they can contribute to the team. And if you're expecting them to attend all steering group meetings, then their time needs to reflect that commitment.
Thank you. That's a very good point. I think we're on our last slide, which is, it's also, I think you want to talk about impact.
Yeah. This was just very raw. So I spent the last 2-3 days sitting on another research council's panel, and I always find that you can really tell that authors have run out of steam by the time they get to the impact and dissemination sections, and people spend so long thinking about the methods and the methodology that they actually forget about what is perhaps the most important part of this application. What is the impact? What is it going to do? So here you need to think about, well, not just what the outputs will be, but how will they be communicated to people. It's a good idea to think about different target audiences and to match the communication methods. So if you're working with young people, for example, then producing a 50-page report for academia is probably not going to be an effective way to disseminate the results. And if you can, be specific. So try and quantify the types of outputs and communication methods, and where possible, give concrete examples, because it just shows that you've thought about impact and you've got some kind of pathway to impact. In the EU and MRC, they talk a lot about pathways to impact. And that just means how are your results and how is your outputs actually going to have the intended consequences that you've sort of set up so beautifully in your rationale and your objectives. And don't leave this bit to the last minute. It's sometimes on a separate part of the form. Treat it as equal importance to the research methodology.
Thank you. I think that's our last slide. So we've got about 1/4 an hour now. If anybody's got any questions, you can stop sharing. I think, Patrick, it'd be nice to see people if they've got any questions. I hope some of those tips were helpful. If anybody's got any questions, or anything they'd like to say or add. Sandra Jumbe.
Hi both, thank you for really informative session. I had a question particularly on your experience of program grants in the sphere of research that's based outside of the UK? Because I guess my experience has always been reviewing NIHR grants, which are predominantly UK based. So just any potential avenues for such opportunities.
Vicky, I'm going to let you answer that one.
So NIHR, the programme grants are the programme grant programme is very much based in the NHS, and that you actually have to apply through the NHS organisation. Their equivalents in terms of their global health stream are their RIGHT programmes, which is all about transforming care, and also their centres and groups. But perhaps the one that's closest to a programme grant in terms of the setup is the MRC programmes, and they're applied because it's very much applied global health research, and there they fund projects for 3 to 5 years for around 2 to 3 million, and many of the themes that you get in the NHR will be played out in the MRC. And in fact, when it comes to global health funding, what you tend to find is that the NIHR will actually join with the MRC to release a call. So it may be on a specific topic. We have a RIGHT grant that was specifically on mental health. There's a call out at the moment for multimorbidity. So they tend to be a little bit themed. But it's really about following exactly the same processes. So thinking about how you can show it's a coherent program of work and not just a single study. But yeah, if you're looking for a program specifically outside the UK, I would probably start with the MRC.
Thank you.
Mark.
Thank you both so much. I mean, it was kind of hard to think of a question initially because you covered everything so well. Like really from everyone who's just starting out putting together a grant to people who've done it before, but maybe could learn a little bit from the current state of things. So thank you both so much. I guess my question was, how much of an intervention do you think there needs to be in the programme grant for it to be taken seriously? How conceptual can it be? Obviously, it can't be develop an intervention because that's not applied research, but if it's something that maybe exists in some places in practice but needs bringing together and maybe made more coherent as one of the work streams and then evaluated, is that suitable for PJFAR?
I can answer that because I've actually co-applicant with co-chief investigator with Hilary Finnick at Edinburgh on a true implementation study around asthma self-management supporting self-management and asthma, and actually it's a lot of stuff that is very, very well supported, having an asthma action plan, annual asthma reviews, all sorts of stuff, but it's just not happening in practice. And so it's all around and the intervention is all around supporting practices to deliver what's already a well-established evidence-based intervention that's just not happening. So I think that's you know, so I think, yes, that's absolutely, you could do that. And I think they quite like that sort of economy of stuff because it's very realistic, isn't it? I think it is really NHS, the NHR programs are very NHS focused, and they are really wanting to address the problems, grassroots problems, inequalities, things happening differently in different places, so no, absolutely, that would definitely fit.
That's a great analogy for what I was thinking of as well. Steph, thank you so much.
Yeah,
and also don't forget the programme development grants as well. That if you've got an idea, but it is really a conceptual idea, you can also apply for a programme development grant to at least show some proof of concept or initial feasibility of the idea.
I don't know, I've had several programme development grants, and the only problem I have with them is that you actually have to have an idea of the programme grant you're going for afterwards. So there's an awful lot of work and thinking in them. They're not quite as blue skies as it sounds like. The other great thing I just wanted to highlight everybody with programme grants is that they've now changed the rules so you can have PhDs in them, which is we've always wanted that. And there's also these extra funding streams. You can bid for bits of extra money if you've got one to do methodological work, and they want that particularly to be led by mid-career or early career researchers, not the chief investigators. So they're really opening it up, and there's a real suite of funding that comes with a programme grant now. I don't, if you could still a question mark, or is it just a delayed hand?
Sorry, just trying to find the button. But I mean, I suppose the problem with the program development grants is that it's not a lot of money, and it's hard to think. So the traditional things you sort of reach for, let's do an evidence synthesis or something like that to try and just pull together a little bit more, but that isn't usually hugely helpful in terms of sort of developing the intervention. So just for my example, one thing I'm really interested in is relational practice. So this is working in psychiatry with people in a way that places an emphasis on relationships rather than outcomes. And there's lots of literature. Some people have tried it here and there, but it needs sort of a coherent intervention developing out of it and then to be evaluated. Now, I don't think with the money for a program development grant, I would be able to sort of do a pilot or something of that really. So it doesn't feel like a helpful stage for that idea. It might be for something else, but
it may be. I don't know. I mean, I think you can use program development grants really constructively. You can use them to build your team. You can use them to you know, do more PPI. You can use them to do some qualitative work. I think that, and I don't know if this has changed, but until recently, you had a 50% chance of successful program grant funding if you'd had a program development grant. They are hugely helpful. And so I'm quite an advocate of program development grants. I've never been involved. I've been involved in 3, and I've never been involved in a program development grant that's not led to a program grant. But use them constructively. Think about what you really, how they could help you. I agree, you could never do a pilot or feasibility study with one.
thank you.
If nobody else has got any more questions, I don't think there are any more raised hands.
Deborah's hand was up.
I'm sorry, Deborah.
But misbehaving a bit.
No, it's okay, and it may be slightly redundant because it's a bit similar to Mark, but as you know, I mean, I've been almost entirely NIHR funded, but perhaps unusual in that also being almost entirely around fellowships. So my question is, do you think that they would consider a program of work that is entirely qualitative, either drawing on different methodologies or different approaches to address a particular issue? And when you use the word intervention, experiment, does there have to be, well, you've said there doesn't have to be an intervention quite as we might imagine it in a trial. But if I think of some of the methods we use, such as video reflexive ethnography, arguably it is an intervention in practice, but it's not an experiment so that's my query. Or do I need to look to another funder? Or do you think a program of work that's coherent but is exploring something that you need qualitative approaches for could be a goer?
For NIHR program grants?
Yeah. Just be honest, because I don't want to spend a lot of time. I'll go somewhere else if it's.
To be the honest truth is, I think I would actually speak to Raj. I'd actually contact them and discuss it with them, right. Sound them out first, because they do. It's such a lot of money they're offering. You know, 2.5 million, that they do sort of forever whatever they say, and yes, they're interested in new methodologies, but they are interested in something that's going to make what they think a big change for patients. And remember, they've dropped it now, but until recently you had to say that you'd be able to impact patients within 5 years of the end of the grant. That was one of the criteria. They've dropped that, but you know, so you have to be able to demonstrate that, you know, something's going to change in a significant way or has the potential to. And so,
well,
but
that
I would discuss it with Raj.
True. One can that can be most certainly true. But it's perhaps it's harder to persuade people that that's the case at the beginning, I suppose.
I'm absolutely sure that it could be true from a suite of qualitative work, but I would definitely sound Raj out first, because they are open to discussions. And you know, I'm sure you could ask them, and then really you'd have to craft it very well. And I would certainly get RDS support for that, and people who've had other program routes to help you just tell them, because a lot of it. I mean, one thing we haven't said, a lot of success in program grants comes from how you write the grant and the crafting of it, and anticipating, because it's going to be reviewed not just by experts in the field, but initially by sort of a hodgepodge of different sort of people who've not got expertise in your area. So you have to sort of spell it out for people as well a bit. I don't know if anybody else has got it. Is there anything you want to say, Vicky? I think you're muted.
Sorry, I think there's one point that's become more of an issue, and I don't know why that reminded me. I think it was just about actually being able to contact them. They're all very, very approachable people. They don't want to waste the reviewer's time reviewing an application that's clearly not going to fit criteria. But also one thing to consider is that they are really starting to clamp down, particularly where you have multiple NIHR grants, on your own time. And this has been raised before about whether a PI, when a PI puts in that they've got 20 or 30%, but they're already running a centre or they're already running another programme grant, they are starting to cross-check. And so, again, it's worth sometimes having a discussion. I had one recently. We've got a right grant and we have a centre grant and a programme grant, and we've got through to another to stage 2, and they actually contacted me to ask about the feasibility of whether I had time, and we sat and went through the timelines together. It's not always an issue as long as you can show that you have a team around you. It's not about the one individual. But it is mindful. I think gone are the days where you could be 200% funded by the NIHR without them noticing. There is definitely more cross-checking across the systems now. So if you do have other big grants, particularly with the same funder, it always worth contacting them just to check that you will be considered eligible still.
Thank you.
Oh, Sandra, have you got another question?
Sorry, I do, yes. Just a very technical one, I guess. So, Vicky, you mentioned about having a co-PI. So logistically, do co-PIs have to split, when you look at time commitments, do you have to split 50-50, or they're open to?
They're open to differences. So in the one that I went for, where we had a co-PI, I was put down as 20% and the co-PI was put down as 10%, and the particular role was in mentorship and support more so than the research. The thing with co-PIs is it very much changes. The person who leads it. So if, for example, if you were going for it and you were the first name, they suddenly get all the correspondence. As soon as you get the grant, they become the main sort of contact. So it's perfectly fine to have a co-PI that's on a little bit less, again, as long as it's realistic. And you have to show why that person is needed as a co-PI and not just as a co-applicant. So there would be an expectation that they will have more of an input and a very specific sort of supporting role.
Thank you. I think that's come nicely to 11:59. So I think we should draw it to a close, and thank you all for great questions and interest, and good luck. Come and ask for help if you're interested. Thank you.
It was really helpful. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all. Thank you very much. Thanks, Patrick, for organising it. Bye. Bye, Vicky.
See you later. Bye.